I've argued before, I think the main problem in this country is that people misunderstand that the culture war, and by extension the generational war, has a material basis to it. And I think, unfortunately, the Conservative Party has really lost sight of the values set forth by former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who understood the most important principle for sustaining British democracy is home ownership. And this is not just the case for millennials, but also for my generation, which is Generation Z coming up, where unless you are lucky enough to come from a family with a lot of wealth and you're going to stand to inherit that wealth, there is a very, very slim chance you're going to be able to get your foot into a housing ladder, onto the housing ladder. If you're a young graduate, for example, in London, you're probably going to be paying about, on average, 40% of your income on rent, which is already extraordinary, and people have discussed before the renting crisis in London. But really what's outrageous is then, if you're a graduate as well, you can expect to be paying about a 42.5% marginal rate of tax. So not only are we penalising young people for lacking wealth to get on the housing market ladder, we're also making it impossible for them to keep their income. So we're taxing people who want to work hard, young people who are pulling themselves up by the bootstraps, they're not being lazy, and we're making it absolutely impossible for them to then gather that wealth to pass on to their own children. There's a very clear generational divide there, and I really am disappointed in the Conservative government for not having the courage to say, this stops now. We can fix this. We are thinking about the future of the country, not just short-term, what do our voter base want?
Yeah, and is that the problem with this? So the sort of ever-tantalising spectre of the grey vote. I mean, at the end of the day, I think about 78% of them turned out to vote in the last general election, compared to 41% of 18 to 24-year-olds. And so evidently, this is a very, when it comes to voting, a very mobile demographic. Is the problem that parties are constantly chasing that vote, rather than actually listening to the needs of those people who will, in theory, become their voters further down the line?
Absolutely. Again, it's what's so disappointing. Boris Johnson is an extremely popular politician. The Conservative Party looks set to be ruling for the next decade or so if things continue as successfully as they have. They have a perfect opportunity here to go outside of what's popular, but what isn't necessarily good in the long term, and say, we know for the long-term future of the country, not just the country, but their own party, we need to make sure that young people are getting those opportunities, they're getting the money so they can turn that into wealth. And then they can start paying into a system. And I think it's disheartening for me, particularly, knowing that I'm paying so much tax on a social welfare net that I probably won't be able to use. The triple lock on pensions is not going to be there when I retire. This scheme is almost totally unsustainable at this point. Many young people aren't using the NHS because we're young, we're broadly quite healthy. So we're seeing all this money going out in taxation. We're going, hang on, what are we getting for this? We're just paying out the nose, and we can't afford a house, we can't, afford to have children, or if we do, we have less children than we want, and we've been penalised for doing what we were told to do at school, which is get a degree, go into a graduate scheme, that's where you make your money. Well, no, that's not great, because you're paying a lot of money for that. It's just a very depressing state of affairs. You kind of get the feeling that you're being totally ignored and also patronised.
I mean, I quite agree with you on that. But in terms of when it comes to the assets that boomers might have accrued, and certainly, we were told earlier that Dame Ros Altman said that 2 million pensioners are living in poverty. Is the problem, in a way, the sense that instead of means testing pensioners, they've been treated almost like a special category in their own right and given perks such as winter heating allowance, even if they're millionaires, or free bus passes, or free TV licences? Again, that's set to be scrapped. But is there a problem that actually, by sort of demarcating pensioners as a special subsection of society, we've almost fed into this intergenerational battle that is being played out in the sort of interviews I'm conducting today?
Absolutely, and I think it's a real shame, because at the end of the day, no young person wants to be taking money from their granny. We don't want to be seen as being selfish. These are real, genuine economic concerns that we have, and it's a shame that we all have to feel like we're scrabbling for that last piece of pie, but it doesn't have to be this way. With some good policy, we could change this, for example, reforming the Planning Act, building more housing. That's a wonderful way to solve the supply crisis. That could burst the housing bubble. But the Tories don't want that to happen because so many of their voters own assets which are always, always, always appreciating in value. Now, that's very short-term thinking, and it's unfortunate that then we get to a state of mind where you've got the elderly saying, oh, I dislike young people, they're all about wokeness, I don't understand what they're saying. You get young people who are totally disconnected from mainstream British society and politics, and so they're turning to quite hateful, far-left ideologies because they feel like they've got no stake in the society they've grown up in. And I do think it is the responsibility of government to step in and say, we've got to fix this. This is a terrible problem, and it's going to blow up in our faces one day. Because at the end of the day, we'll get old too, and we won't be voting Tory.